Looking back, I should have known that saving the dying wolf in the clearing would be the catalyst for the destruction of my carefully constructed lie. What would you have done in my place? Run or stay?
Hi! Welcome to Vine Romance, where love speaks and hearts connect. If you believe in beautiful love stories, hit subscribe, like, and comment. And kindly join our growing family. Let's grow in love together.
Now the story. Looking back, I should have known that saving the dying wolf in the clearing would be the catalyst for the destruction of my carefully constructed lie. June knelt in the damp moss, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The massive beast before her was a mountain of obsidian fur and shredded flesh, his scent, thick with copper and wood smoke, threatening to overwhelm her. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the way the silver-dipped wounds on his flank hissed against the misty air. Truth be told, she should have run because humans didn't survive encounters with the wild alpha's kind. Instead, her hands moved on instinct. She reached into her leather satchel, her fingers brushing the glass vial of her scent-masking serum. It was her only shield, the secret that kept her invisible in a world of predators. But then, the wolf let out a whimper so broken it fractured her resolve. She was a ghost living on the whispering border, a woman who had traded her name for a life of quiet shadows. For years she had lived as a phantom, blending into the tree line by suppressing every trace of her human sweetness with her bitter alchemical brew. She knew the rules. Don't be seen, don't be heard, and never, ever touch a shifter. Yet, as she looked at the dying creature, she saw the man beneath the fur. He wasn't just a monster, he was a soul on the brink of fading. Because she was a healer, she couldn't let him go. She poured a drop of her refined serum onto the wound, watching the silver-black rot recoil. Moments later, a shadow fell over her. June froze, her breath hitching in her throat as the sound of heavy paws thudded against the earth. She didn't know what scared her more, the dying wolf or the pack members surely hunting him. What followed was a choice that would tilt her world. She grabbed the beast's heavy head, whispering words of comfort she hadn't spoken to another soul in a decade. Why was she doing this? Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the crushing weight of her own loneliness finally breaking through the ice. Suddenly, the wolf's golden eyes snapped open. The moment their eyes locked, June felt a jolt of electricity surge through her fingertips, snapping like a whip. In the span of a breath, the air thickened. It wasn't just fear. It was something ancient and hungry. Still, she didn't pull away. She watched the pupils dilate, tracking her every movement with a predatory focus that made her skin prickle. Beneath the moonlight, the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the monster to strike or the girl to vanish. What's worse, she could hear the crashing of brush in the distance. The guards were coming. If they found her here, smelling of herbs and medicine instead of a wolf, they would tear her apart to see what made her tick. Despite that, she stayed. She pressed her hand firmer against his chest, feeling the frantic, jagged beat of his heart. As her own pulse raced, she realized she had just stepped out of the shadows and into the light of a wildfire. Next, the wolf let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through June's very bones. It wasn't a threat, it was a claim. In that moment, she felt it, etched in fire, A bond was forming. A tether made of blood and silver that she couldn't cut. She tried to pull back, but his claws snagged her cloak, anchoring her to him. Before she could move, the brush exploded. 3 massive wolves skidded into the clearing, their teeth bared and eyes glowing with a feral light. "Stay back!" June shouted, her voice trembling. Her body moved on instinct, stepping between the dying alpha and his own warriors. She looked like a small, fragile thing compared to them, a blade of grass facing a storm. Rather than running, she held her ground because she knew the alpha wouldn't survive a rough transition back to the pack house. The largest wolf, a grey brute with a notched ear, lunged forward with a snarl. Soon after, the black wolf behind her shifted. The sound was a sickening crunch of bone and stretching muscle, a violent, beautiful symphony of transformation. June shielded her eyes, but the heat radiating from him was like standing before an open furnace. When she looked again, a man sat in the dirt. He was tall, his bronze skin mapped with scars and his dark hair matted with blood. Fenris, the wild alpha. What followed was silence so loud it roared. Fenris looked at the guards, his gaze cold enough to freeze the marrow in their bones. He didn't speak, yet the grey wolf immediately tucked its tail and whimpered. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted for June. She wasn't just a stray healer anymore. She was the woman holding the alpha's life in her hands. "She stays," Fenris croaked, his voice like grinding stones. He looked at June, his golden eyes burning with an intensity that made her chest ache. Not only that, he reached out and wrapped his blood-stained fingers around her wrist. "Mine," he whispered. The space between them burned. June wanted to scream that she was human, that she was a lie, but the words died in her throat. Instead, she allowed the guards to lift her. They moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency, surrounding her like a cage of fur and muscle. As the sky darkened, she realized her ordinary world was gone. She was being taken into the heart of the Iron Peak, the one place a human should never go. Even so, as Fenris's head slumped against her shoulder, she felt a strange, terrifying sense of belonging. Eventually they reached the stone gates of the pack house. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of pine and old power. June felt the eyes of 100 wolves on her, judging her, scenting for the truth. She clutched her satchel closer because the serum was running low. If she couldn't make more, the entire pack would smell her humanity by morning. What's worse, the High Elders were waiting. They stood like statues in the courtyard, their faces etched with suspicion. They didn't see a savior, they saw a threat. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was a lamb walking into a den of lions. Yet, as she looked down at Fenris, she saw him watch her with a strange, possessive wonder. In the stillness that followed, a single elder stepped forward. "A human?" he hissed, his nostrils flaring. June's heart skipped. The air thickened with the threat of violence. Before either could speak, Fenris tightened his grip on her hand, his nails digging into her skin. "Luna?" Fenris growled, the word hanging in the air like a death sentence. The tension broke as a gasp rippled through the crowd. June's soul answered with a throb of pure terror. She wasn't just a guest, she had been claimed. And she didn't know what was more dangerous, the vampires hunting the alpha, or the alpha himself. That night, as they moved her into the high tower, she realized the blood bond wasn't just a connection. It was a curse. Every step he took, she felt it, a pulse in her blood that answered his. She looked out at the jagged mountains, knowing her carefully constructed life was over. Between them, something cracked. The lie was still there, but the desire was starting to burn through the mask. Soon after, she was left alone in a room that smelled of him. Her thoughts spun. How could she keep her secret when his senses were so sharp? As the wind shifted, she heard the distant, a haunting cry of a wolf. It sounded like a warning. She touched her wrist where he had held her skin still humming from his touch. Moments later, a soft knock sounded at the door. She expected a guard, but instead a young girl with large, frightened eyes slipped inside. "He's dying again," the girl whispered. "The silver, it's spreading." June didn't hesitate. Her instincts surged. She followed the girl through the dark corridors, her mind racing. Because of that, she found herself back at Fenris's bedside. He was thrashing, his skin grey and clammy. The elders stood back, helpless against the poison. June pushed past them, her movements sharp and certain. Without thinking, she bit her own lip, letting a single drop of her blood fall into his open wound. At that moment, the mark on her arm tingled. She felt it, etched in fire. The bond snapped into place, fully formed and undeniable. Fenris went still, his eyes flying open as he gripped her waist, pulling her flush against his heat. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, June realized there was no turning back. She was the wild alpha's true Luna, and the war for her soul had just begun. Fenris's grip was like a vice, his fingers digging into the soft flesh of June's waist as if he were trying to pull her soul into his own chest. The room smelled of sweat, copper, and that intoxicating, dangerous musk that only belonged to him. Despite the heavy presence of the elders watching from the shadows, June could only feel the searing heat where their skin met. Truth be told, she should have been terrified of the mark glowing on her arm, but the way his golden eyes searched hers made her breath hitch. Moments later, the lead elder, a man with hair as white as bone and eyes like flint, stepped into the candlelight. "You've done more than heal him, human," he hissed, his voice dripping with a poison of its own. "You've tied the fate of the Iron Peak to a creature who cannot even shift." Because of that statement, the air in the room turned cold, the weight of 100 years of tradition pressing down on June's narrow shoulders. She tried to pull away, but Fenris growled, a low, rumbling sound that made the floorboards vibrate beneath her boots. Instead of releasing her, the alpha pulled her closer, his face burying into the crook of her neck. As his scent filled her lungs, June felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated desire that made her knees weak. It was a hunger she didn't recognize, then a primal need that whispered through her blood and silenced the voice in her head telling her to run. What followed was a moment of agonizing silence, as the elders realized their alpha wasn't just recovering, he was claiming. Without thinking, June reached up and brushed a stray lock of dark hair from Fenris's forehead. Her body moved on instinct, her touch soothing the jagged lines of pain around his eyes. She didn't know why she was comforting the man who had effectively kidnapped her. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was the way the blood bond hummed like a live wire between their hearts. Rather than scolding her, Fenris let out a soft sigh, his eyes closing as he leaned into her hand. But then, the heavy oak doors of the chamber burst open. A scout, his clothes torn and covered in soot, collapsed at the foot of the bed. The Night Stalkers!" the man wheezed, his eyes wide with a terror that made June's skin crawl. They've crossed the whispering border. They're looking for the ghost healer. What's worse, the scout's gaze landed directly on June, and she realized the secret she had spent years protecting was now a beacon for the very monsters she feared most. At that moment, the world tilted towards June. She wasn't just a captive Luna anymore, she was a target. The elders erupted into a cacophony of barks and shouts, some demanding she be handed over to save the pack, while others looked at Fenris for a command. Even so, Fenris didn't move an inch. He rose from the bed, his naked chest gleaming in the firelight, and stood like a shield between June and the rest of the world. Next, he turned his head, now his profile sharp and lethal against the dancing shadows. "If the vampires want her," he said, his voice a promise of slaughter, "they will have to walk through the ashes of every wolf in this territory." Not only that, he reached back and took June's hand, lacing his fingers with hers so tightly she could feel his pulse. The tension broke as the pack realized their alpha would choose a human over peace. By the time the guards had mobilized, June was being led deeper into the fortress. She felt like a doll being dragged through a nightmare, her thoughts spinning with the realization that the vampires didn't want her for her blood. They wanted her serum. They wanted the power to move through the woods unseen, to become ghosts just like her. Because of that, she knew she couldn't stay in the tower like a prize. Soon after, she found herself in a small stone-walled laboratory at the base of the mountain. Fenris had ordered the pack's finest herbs and minerals brought to her, his eyes demanding she work her magic. "Protect us," he whispered, his thumb grazing her lower lip. June felt it, etched in fire, the responsibility of an entire pack resting on her human hands. She didn't know if she could do it, but the way he looked at her made her want to try. Still, the fear remained. As the wind shifted outside, carrying the faint metallic scent of the coming coven, June looked at the glass vials and the dried lavender. She was a woman of science in a world of monsters, a healer caught in the middle of a war she didn't start. Truth be told, she missed the silence of her apothecary, but as she looked at the heavy door where Fenris stood guard, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. What's worse, her serum was almost gone. She held the last vial to the light, the liquid shimmering like a dying star. If she couldn't replicate the formula with the local mountain plants, her humanity would be laid bare for everyone to scent. To make things worse, the elders were already whispering about a test to prove she was worthy of the Alpha's mark. Eventually, the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long, bloody shadows across the stone floor. June worked until her fingers were stained purple and her back ached. Every now and then, she would look up and see Fenris watching her from the doorway, his golden eyes never leaving her. He didn't speak, but the bond between them pulsed with every heartbeat, a steady reminder that she was his. Between one breath and the next, the first scream echoed through the mountain. It was high, thin, and full of a cold, unnatural hunger. The vampires had arrived. June's breath caught as the laboratory door slammed shut and Fenris bolted it from the outside. "Don't come out!" his voice roared through the wood. "No matter what you hear, do not come out." In the quiet that followed, June stood frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs. She could hear the sounds of the struggle, the snarling of wolves, the tearing of flesh, and the terrifyingly silent movement of the night stalkers. As the silence roared in her ears, she realized she couldn't just sit there. She grabbed a heavy iron mortar and her last vial of serum, her knuckles white with tension. Without thinking, she began to mix a new concoction, adding the pungent root of a mountain lily to a base of wolfsbane. It was a gamble, a dangerous mix that could either save them or kill everyone in the room. But she was the true Luna, and her soul answered the call of the battle raging outside. She wouldn't be a ghost anymore. She would be the fire that burned the shadows away. Moments later, a clawed hand smashed through the high, narrow window of the lab. A pale, beautiful face with eyes like rubies peered inside, a cruel smile stretching across its lips. "The healer," the vampire purred, its voice like silk on a blade. June didn't scream. Instead, she threw the vial of unfinished serum directly into the creature's face. As fire bloomed beneath the vampire's skin, it let out a shriek that tore through the night. The liquid acted like acid against the creature's cursed flesh, sending it reeling back into the darkness. At that moment, June felt a surge of power she had never known. She wasn't weak because she was human. She was dangerous because she knew how the world worked. What followed was a crash as the laboratory door was kicked open. Fenris stood there, his body covered in the black blood of his enemies, his eyes wild and feral. He saw the dying vampire outside the window and then looked at June, his chest heaving. Without another word, he crossed the room and crushed her into a kiss that tasted of iron and victory. Deep down, she knew the truth. The battle was only beginning. The Night Stalkers would return with more numbers, and the Elders would still try to tear them apart. Yet, as she looked into the eyes of the wild Alpha, she knew she would fight to the last breath to stay by his side. The ghost healer was dead, and the true Luna had finally found her home. June stood in the middle of the ruined laboratory, her chest heaving as the metallic tang of vampire blood filled the air. Fenris pulled back from the kiss, his golden eyes scanning her face for injuries with a hunger that made her skin prickle. Truth be told, she felt like a different person than the girl who had arrived in the Packlands only yesterday. The laboratory was a mess of shattered glass and spilled herbs, yet she felt a strange sense of calm in the chaos. Because of that victory, she finally understood that her humanity wasn't just a burden to hide, it was a weapon to be wielded. Moments later, the heavy silence of the mountain was broken by the rhythmic thud of approaching paws. Fenris shifted his weight, his muscles rippling under his scarred skin as he positioned himself in front of her once again. What followed was the arrival of the High Elders, their faces pale and drawn as they stepped over the charred remains of the vampire June had struck down. They didn't look grateful, rather they looked terrified of the power the human girl now held over their Alpha's heart. Instead of hiding behind Fenris, June stepped forward, wiping a smudge of soot from her cheek. She didn't know what gave her the courage to face the bone-white stare of the lead elder. But the bond in her blood was humming with a new, fierce energy. "The Night Stalkers will be back," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "In fact, they now know exactly where I am, which means the Iron Peak is no longer a fortress, it's a target." But then, all the lead elder narrowed his eyes, his gaze dropping to the empty glass vial in her hand. "The girl is right," he admitted, his voice like gravel grinding together. "Still, we cannot trust a Luna who smells of the woods instead of the pack." What's worse, he pointed a gnarled finger toward the jagged cliffs of the Trial Peak, where the moon was beginning to rise. Before the sun touches the valley, you must pass the trial of the moon eye, or you will be exiled for bringing this curse upon us. At that moment, June felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. She knew the trial was designed for shifters, a race through the shifting shadows where only the keenest senses could navigate the lethal terrain. Without thinking, she looked at Fenris, hoping he would object. But he remained silent, his jaw tight. Maybe it was fate demanding she prove her worth, or maybe it was just the pack's way of ensuring she died without them having to spill her blood themselves. Next, Fenris stepped toward her, his large hand cupping her jaw with a tenderness that felt like a goodbye. "I cannot help you there, June," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Not only that, the spirits of the mountain will know if I interfere, and they will claim us both." Even so, he leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, the blood bond pulsing so loudly she could hear it in her own skull. By the time they reached the base of the Trial Peak, the air had grown thin and biting. June's serum was officially gone, and for the first time in years her scent was blooming, sweet, floral, and undeniably human. She felt it etched in fire, the way every wolf on the ridge began to track her, their pupils dilating as they caught the scent of prey. Because she was no longer invisible, every movement felt like a gamble with her life. Soon after, the elder cracked a ceremonial whip against the stone, signalling the start of the race. June bolted into the dark tree line, her heart slamming against her ribs. She didn't have claws or night vision, yet her alchemical intuition allowed her to read the forest in a different way. She didn't see the path. She felt the dampness of the moss and smelled the sharp ozone of the cliff edges. Still, the obstacles were brutal. A massive landslide had blocked the main pass, and June had to climb the sheer rock face with nothing but her bare hands. To make things worse, she could hear the haunting, melodic laughter of the vampires lingering in the shadows below, waiting for her to slip. Despite that, she kept climbing, her fingers bleeding and her lungs burning for air. Eventually, she reached the summit, where a single ancient stone altar sat under the direct light of the full moon. Her thoughts spun as she realized the trial wasn't just about speed, it was about sacrifice. On the altar sat a bowl of silver-laced water, poison to a shifter, but a test of purity for a human. As the wind shifted, carrying Fenris's distant, agonized howl from the valley below, June realized he was feeling her pain through the bond. What's worse, a shadow detached itself from the trees. It wasn't an elder or a wolf, but the high priestess of the pack, a woman who had remained silent until now. "Drink," the woman commanded, her eyes glowing with a strange silvery light. Truth be told, if your soul is truly tied to the Alpha, the silver will not touch you. Instead, it will reveal the Luna within. Between one breath and the next, June picked up the bowl. She didn't know if she would survive the night, but she knew she couldn't go back to being a ghost. She drank the bitter liquid, her throat constricting as the coldness spread through her veins. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. The silver didn't burn, rather it ignited a dormant spark in her blood that she hadn't known existed. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, June's vision cleared, and she saw the forest not as a place of danger, but as a map of energy. She saw the hidden paths, the vibrating life of the trees and the dark, oily presence of the vampires lurking at the borders. In that moment, but she realized she was the first human Luna because she could see the threats the wolves were blind to. What followed was a roar of triumph that ripped from her own throat. Not a wolf's howl, but a resonant, haunting song that echoed across the peaks. The tension broke as the priestess bowed her head, recognizing the power of the ghost healer. June had passed the test, but the victory felt hollow as she saw the horizon glowing with a dark, unnatural red. Moments later, she realized the vampires hadn't been waiting for her to fail. They had used the trial as a distraction to launch a full-scale assault on the pack house below. Because of that realization, June turned and began to run back down the mountain, her new senses guiding her through the darkness. She wasn't running to hide anymore. Deep down, and she knew the truth, the Night Stalkers were already inside the gates. Fenris was fighting for his life, and she was the only one who could see the invisible trap they had set for him. Yet, as she leapt over a fallen log, her soul answered his call with a ferocity that terrified her. The trial was over, but the war for the Iron Peak had only just begun. June plummeted down the mountain, her boots skidding on the loose shale as the wind whipped her hair into a frenzy. The valley below was no longer a sanctuary, it was a bowl of shadows and fire. Truth be told, her human lungs felt like they were collapsing, but the new silver light in her veins propelled her forward with a strength that wasn't her own. She could see them now, dark, oily ripples in the air that the wolves were missing entirely. Because of the moon-eye vision, the invisible vampires were as clear to her as blood on snow. Moments later, she breached the tree line near the pack house, her heart slamming against her ribs. The scene was a nightmare of silent slaughter. High-ranking warriors were being thrown aside by invisible hands, their throats opening to wounds from air that seemed empty. What followed was a scream of pure agony that tore through the chaos. It was Fenris. He was in the centre of the courtyard, his massive black wolf form thrashing as 3 invisible night stalkers clung to his back, their shadow claws digging into his spine. Instead of freezing in terror, June's body moved on instinct. She grabbed a discarded spear from a fallen guard, her knuckles white with a desperate resolve. She didn't have a wolf's strength, but she had the truth. "To your left, Fenris," she shrieked, her voice cutting through the snarls like a silver bell. Because he trusted her soul more than his own senses, Fenris spun blindly, his massive jaws snapping shut on the throat of an invisible attacker she had pointed out. But then the air thickened around June. A cold, dead hand wrapped around her throat, lifting her off her feet until her toes dangled inches above the gravel. What's worse, the vampire's cloaking faded just enough for her to see Silas's cruel, ruby-red eyes. "You see us, don't you, little ghost?" he purred, his breath smelling of ancient rot. "Not only that, you're going to help us walk into every pack house from here to the sea." In that moment, June felt a jolt of electricity from the blood bond that nearly blinded her. Fenris saw her being held, and his roar shook the very foundation of the mountain. For he didn't care about the invisible blades cutting into his flanks, he only cared about the woman in the monster's grip. Without thinking, he shifted back to his human form mid-air, a move that was as dangerous as it was breathtaking, and lunged for Silas with his bare hands. Next, the 2 titans collided, a blur of bronze skin and pale dead flesh. June fell to the ground, gasping for air as the world spun. She realized that Silas was leading Fenris toward the shadow trap she had seen from the peak, a circle of ancient sun-blocking stones that would drain a shifter's power in seconds. Even so, her voice was trapped in her bruised throat. She watched, horrified, as Fenris drove Silas backward, straight into the center of the trap. By the time she found her voice, the stones began to glow with a sickly purple light. Fenris let out a sound that would haunt June's dreams, a hollow, vibrating groan of a man losing his very essence. His muscles spasmed, and his golden eyes began to fade into a dull, lifeless grey. Because the trap was designed to sever the connection between the shifter and the moon, Fenris was being stripped of his wolf and his life at the same time. Soon after, Silas stepped out of the circle unaffected by the magic. He looked down at the dying Alpha with a bored expression, then turned his hungry gaze back toward June. "Now, healer," he whispered. "Let's see what your blood can really do." He stepped toward her, his movements a terrifyingly fluid glide. To make things worse, the pack guards were still fighting invisible thralls at the gates, unable to reach their fallen leader. Still, June didn't back down. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the iron mortar she had used in the lab, which still held the residue of the poisonous mountain lily and wolfsbane. It wasn't a weapon. It was a prayer. As the silence roared between her and the vampire, she realized that the moon eye wasn't just for seeing, it was for connecting. She closed her eyes and reached out through the bond, searching for the flickering spark of Fenris's soul inside the trap. Eventually she found it. It was a tiny shivering flame, buried deep under the weight of the shadow magic. "Fenris, look at me," she screamed, her internal monologue a frantic chant of "Don't leave me, don't leave me." Rather than giving up, she focused all the silver light in her blood toward him, acting as a bridge between the moon above and the dying man in the circle. What followed was a revelation. The blood bond pulsed with a violent, white-hot intensity. Not only did it connect their hearts, but it allowed June to share her humanity, her resistance to the shadow magic, with him. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Fenris's eyes snapped open, glowing with a light that was no longer gold, but a brilliant, searing silver. Between one breath and the next, the shadow trap shattered. The ancient stones exploded into dust as Fenris rose, his body wreathed in the same lunar light that danced in June's veins. He wasn't just an alpha anymore. He was something the world hadn't seen in 1,000 years. Without another word, he moved. Silas didn't even have time to scream before Fenris's silver-charged fist tore through the vampire's chest. As fire bloomed beneath the vampire's skin, Silas dissolved into ash, the wind carrying his remains into the dark. The remaining invisible thralls, sensing their master's death, shrieked and fled back into the woods. The tension broke as the pack fell silent, watching their alpha stand over the remains of the most feared vampire in the territory. Fenris turned to June, his chest heaving, his face covered in soot and victory. Moments later, he collapsed to his knees, his strength spent. June ran to him, her soul answering his exhaustion with a wave of protective love. She pulled his heavy head into her lap, her fingers tracing the marks the trap had left on his skin. Truth be told, they had won the battle, but she could see the way the High Elders were looking at them from the shadows. their eyes full of fear and newfound greed. Deep down, but she knew the truth. The midpoint shift had changed everything. She was no longer a secret healer, and Fenris was no longer a simple alpha. They were a legend in the making, and a legend was a target for everyone with a thirst for power. Yet, as she held him under the fading moon, June didn't care about the wars to come. She had been seen, she had been claimed, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged. Fenris remained on his knees, his forehead resting against June's collarbone as the silver light in his skin slowly dimmed to a soft, rhythmic pulse. The courtyard was a graveyard of ash and broken stone, yet the air felt thick with a new, suffocating tension. Truth be told, the danger of the vampires had been replaced by something much closer to home. June looked up, her moon-eye vision still lingering, and saw the high elders encircling them, not in protection but in a cold, calculating formation. Moments later, the lead elder stepped into the center of the ring, his face a mask of twisted ambition. "The Alpha has been tainted by human blood," he declared, his voice booming across the silent pack. "Because of this girl, our lineage has been altered. He is no longer fit to lead the Iron Peak." What followed was a gasp from the younger warriors, their eyes darting between their kneeling king and the ancient men who held the pack's laws in their withered hands. Instead of trembling, June felt a surge of cold fury that made her bones hum. She stood up, forcing Fenris to lean against her for support, her hand gripping his shoulder with a strength that surprised them both. "He saved you!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the mountain walls. "In fact, he destroyed the coven that would have turned your pups into cattle while you stood in the shadows and watched." But then, the elder levelled his gaze at June, a predatory smile touching his lips. "It is not his strength we question, human. It is yours." What's worse, he gestured toward the iron-bound gates of the Forbidden Archive, a place where the pack's darkest secrets were kept under lock and key. "Not only that, you have revealed a power that belongs to the wolves. Since you are not one of us, you must be refined, so the pack can harness that silver light for our own glory." At that moment, June realized the test from Act 3 was a lie. They had always intended to use her as a breeding tool or a laboratory specimen. She felt Fenris's fingers tighten on her wrist, his voice a low and dangerous vibration in her ear. "Run," he whispered, the single word a jagged plea. Without thinking, June looked at the gates, then back at the man who had nearly died to keep her safe. Next, Fenris forced himself to his feet, his silver eyes flashing with a final, desperate spark of dominance. He didn't look at the elders, he looked at his pack. "She is your Luna," he roared, but the sound was thinner than before, his body still recovering from the shadow trap. The elders didn't flinch. Rather, they signaled the Iron Guard, a group of brainwashed enforcers who answered only to the council, to move in. By the time the first guard reached them, June had made her choice. She wouldn't run and leave Fenris to be deposed and executed. Because she was his true Luna, she would take the ultimate risk. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the very thing she had been hiding, the original concentrated formula of her scent mask and serum. To make things worse, she didn't apply it to her skin. She drank it. Soon after, the room seemed to explode in a kaleidoscope of colours. The serum, meant only for external use, reacted violently with the silver-laced water still in her system. Still, she didn't scream. She felt her very biology begin to rewrite itself, the human and the alchemical and the wolf bond clashing in a war for her DNA. Her body moved on instinct, her vision expanding until she could see the heartbeats of every wolf in the courtyard. Eventually, a wave of pure white energy rolled out from her chest, knocking the iron guard backward like dry leaves in a gale. The silence that followed was absolute. June stood in the center of the clearing, her skin glowing with a steady, ethereal light that made the elders recoil in terror. What's worse, her scent had changed again. It wasn't human, and it wasn't a wolf. It smelled of ancient starlight and cold, unyielding power. Between one breath and the next, Fenris was at her side, his arms wrapping around her as if to keep her from floating away. "What have you done?" he whispered, his voice full of a warm and wandering fear. June looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see a monster. She saw her mate. "I've stopped hiding," she said, her voice sounding like the chime of 1,000 bells. What followed was a direct challenge. June turned to the lead elder, her eyes burning with a silver fire that made him drop his gaze. "You want the light of the Luna?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the mountain. "Then come and take it." Not only that, she stepped toward the council, forcing them to retreat before a power they couldn't understand. That night, the Iron Peak was divided. Half the pack followed Fenris and June into the higher caves, choosing the new light over the old law. The other half remained with the elders, plotting in the dark. As the silence roared between the two factions, June realized they were no longer a pack. They were a rebellion. Deep down, she knew the truth. There was no turning back to her apothecary or her ghost life. She had committed to a path that would either save the shifter race or burn it to the ground. Yet, as she lay in Fenris's arms in the hidden caves, his scent finally mixing with hers in a perfect permanent harmony, June wasn't afraid. She was the wild alpha's true Luna, and she was finally ready to lead. The hidden caves were cold, the damp stone walls weeping with a frost that even Fenris's heat couldn't fully thaw. June sat by the small fire, her hands trembling as the silver glow beneath her skin flickered like a candle in a gale. Truth be told, the power she had claimed was eating her alive, her human heart struggling to rhythmically beat against the surge of alchemical energy. Because she had combined the serum and the moon eye light, her body was becoming a battlefield where science and magic fought for every inch of her marrow. Moments later, a shadow detached itself from the cave entrance. It was Fenris, his face hollowed by exhaustion and the weight of the crown he no longer wore. He didn't speak. Instead, when he knelt beside her and pulled her into his lap, his scent the only thing keeping her grounded to the earth. What followed was a silence so heavy it felt like the mountain itself was pressing down on them. She could feel his grief through the bond, the loss of his pack, his home, and the brothers who had turned their backs on him. Instead of offering empty hope, June leaned her head against his chest, listening to the jagged, uneven thud of his heart. She knew he was blaming himself for her condition, his golden eyes full of a dark, simmering guilt. "I shouldn't have let you drink it," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. What's worse, the silver light in her eyes flared, blinding her for a second as a wave of nausea washed over her. But then, the sound of a horn echoed from the valley below, a sharp, discordant note that meant the elders had made a deal with the devil. At that moment, June crawled to the edge of the cave and looked down, her moon-eye vision piercing through the mist. She saw the Iron Guard marching alongside the remnants of the Night Stalkers, the wolves and vampires united by a common greed for her blood. Without thinking, she turned to Fenris, her face pale. "They're coming for the light," she whispered. Next, the first betrayal struck. One of the loyalist wolves who had followed them into the caves stepped forward, a silver dagger hidden in his palm. He didn't look at Fenris. He looked at June with a desperate, starving hunger. "The elders promised us safety if we gave you up," the man cried, his voice breaking with shame. Not only that, he lunged before Fenris could shift, the silver blade slicing deep into June's shoulder. By the time Fenris had torn the traitor away, the damage was done. The silver in the blade reacted with the alchemical energy in June's blood, causing a chain reaction of agonizing light that sent her spiraling into darkness. Still, she could hear the sounds of the caves being overrun, the snarls of their few defenders being silenced, and the cold, melodic laughter of the vampires. Because the bond was damaged by the silver, she felt Fenris's presence slipping away, his screams of rage sounding like they were miles underwater. Soon after, June was dragged from the cave, her body limp and her vision fading into a dull grey haze. She saw Fenris being pinned down by 5 iron guards, his silver eyes dimming as they shoved a heavy, shadow-dampening collar around his neck. To make things worse, the lead elder stood over them, his eyes reflecting the dying embers of their fire. "The Alpha will watch," the elder sneered, "while we take what is ours." Eventually they reached the bottom of the mountain, where a massive black iron carriage waited. June was tossed inside like a sack of grain, her shoulder burning with a fire that felt like it was melting her soul. What's worse, she saw the ghost healer apothecary in the distance, the place she had once called home, being burned to the ground by the vampires. Deep down, she knew the truth. She had lost everything, her secret, her mate, and her life. Between one breath and the next, the carriage door slammed shut, plunging her into total darkness. She was alone, broken, and being delivered to a laboratory where she would be drained until there was nothing left. As the silence roared in her ears, June felt the last spark of the moon eye flicker and die. The goal seemed impossible, the ghost was finally caught, and the Luna was extinguished. The darkness of the carriage was absolute, but the silence inside June's head was even louder. She lay on the cold floor, her shoulder a mess of silver burns, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Truth be told, she wanted to let the darkness take her, to simply stop fighting a world that demanded so much of her blood. Because the moon eye was gone, she felt blind and small again, just a human girl in a cage. Moments later, the carriage hit a deep rut, jarring her body and sending a fresh wave of agony through her chest. What followed was a voice, thin and raspy, coming from the corner of the small box. "He's still alive. In June." It was the young girl from the pack house, the one who had led her to Fenris's bedside. She was huddled in the shadows, her hands bound but her eyes burning with a fierce, stubborn hope. Instead of sinking into despair, June felt a tiny spark of warmth ignite in the centre of her ribcage. It wasn't the alchemical light, but something human, a refusal to let the monsters have the last word. "How do you know?" June whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. Rather than answering with words, the girl leaned forward and pressed her forehead against June's, and suddenly, the bond flared. In that moment, June realized that the blood bond wasn't something the silver could kill because it wasn't tied to her sight or her magic. It was tied to her heartbeat. She felt Fenris, distant, muffled, Wand drowning in the shadow magic of his collar, but he was fighting. Next, her vision didn't just return, it exploded. The silver light didn't come from the moon this time. It came from within, fueled by the rage of a woman who was tired of being hunted. Without thinking, June sat up, her fingers fumbling with the silver dagger the traitor had left in her shoulder. It burned like ice, yet she gripped the hilt and pulled it free with a scream of pure defiance. Not only that, she realized the silver in the blade was exactly what she needed to disrupt the iron lock of the carriage. She began to scrape the metal against the door's hinges, her movements fast and frantic. By the time the carriage slowed, June had weakened the iron. She looked at the young girl and saw her own reflection in the child's eyes. No longer a ghost, all but a queen in the making. "When I open this door," June whispered, "you run for the woods. Find the wolves who are still loyal. Tell them Luna is coming." Still, the fear was there, but it was a cold, sharp tool she could now use. Soon after, the carriage door was flung open by an iron guard, his face twisted in a cruel sneer. Before he could move, June lunged, driving the silver dagger into the gap of his armor. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, the silver energy from her blood surged through the blade, turning the guard into a pillar of ash. What followed was a moment of absolute stillness before the alarm was raised. Eventually, June breached the tree line of the pack house for the second time, but she wasn't running to hide. She saw the elders standing on the balcony, so prepared to drain Fenris in front of the entire pack, to purify the lineage. To make things worse, Silas's successor, a younger, hungrier vampire, was stepping toward Fenris with a hollowed-out needle. Because she could see the energy of the world now, June didn't need a weapon. She was the weapon. Between one breath and the next, she let out a roar that wasn't a howl but a command. The forest itself seemed to answer, the trees swaying and the ground trembling as she stepped into the courtyard. Under the weight of his stare, the lead elder froze, his face turning pale as he saw the human girl glowing like a fallen star. Her soul answered the bond, and across the clearing, Fenris's eyes snapped open, the shadow collar beginning to crack under the pressure of her proximity. June marched into the center of the courtyard, her footsteps heavy with the weight of 1,000 years of suppressed humanity. The air thickened around her, vibrating with the raw, silver power that radiated from her skin like heat from a forge. Truth be told, she didn't feel like a healer or a ghost anymore. She felt like a storm that had finally reached the shore. Because she was no longer suppressing her nature, the ground beneath her boots began to frost, the very mountain acknowledging its true Luna. Moments later, the lead elder let out a shriek of panicked command, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of iron shattering. What followed was a spectacle of primal power, as Fenris, fueled by June's proximity, tore the shadow collar from his neck with his bare hands. The metal didn't just break. It disintegrated into black dust as he let out a roar that shook the stars from the sky. Instead of shifting into his wolf, he remained human. his skin glowing with the same brilliant silver light that poured from June's eyes. In that moment, the blood bond reached its final perfect form. The space between them burned as they moved toward each other, the iron guard falling back in terror as the couple became a singular force of nature. Without thinking, June reached out her hand, and Fenris caught it, their fingers interlacing in a grip that defied the laws of the world. Next, the silver energy erupted, a blinding wave of pure light that swept through the courtyard, dissolving every invisible vampire and shattering the weapons of every traitorous wolf. But then, the younger vampire successor lunged from the balcony, to a blur of pale limbs and fangs aimed at June's throat. Before either could speak, June turned her gaze toward him, and the air around the creature ignited. She didn't move a muscle, yet the vampire was pinned against the stone wall by the sheer pressure of her will. Not only that, she felt the monster's life force, a cold, oily thing, and with a flick of her wrist she snuffed it out like a candle in a hurricane. By the time the dust settled, the lead elder was the only one left standing, his knees knocking as he looked into the eyes of the woman he had called a null. Still, June didn't kill him. She stepped close, her scent, now a breathtaking mix of mountain air, silver and sweet honey, filling his lungs until he choked. "The old laws are dead," she whispered, her voice a chime that resonated in the hearts of every wolf watching from the shadows. Rather than striking him down, she let the weight of her authority force him to his knees. Soon after, Fenris stood behind her, his large hands resting on her shoulders as he looked out at his people. His golden eyes were gone, replaced by the permanent regal silver of a true alpha. Even so, he didn't address the pack. He looked only at June, his face full of a deep emotional connection that made her chest ache with joy. "Look at me," he murmured, his voice thick with a passion that had been earned in blood. Eventually the dawn began to break over the Iron Peak, the first rays of sun hitting the laboratory where it all began. What followed was a moment of absolute peace as the new light pack gathered around them, bowing their heads in a silent vow of loyalty. To make things worse for their enemies, the word would spread that the Iron Peak was no longer a pack of wolves, but a sanctuary where soul mattered more than skin. Because of June's sacrifice, the shifter race had evolved, and the ghost healer was now their eternal queen. That morning, Fenris led June to the highest peak, the place where they could see both the whispering border and the vast, untamed wilds. He pulled her flush against his chest, his heart beating a steady rhythmic song against hers. "I should have known," he whispered, his lips brushing her temple, "that the girl in the clearing would be the one to save my soul." Between one breath and the next, June felt the last of her fears vanish, replaced by the warmth of a love that was etched in fire. In the quiet that followed, she looked out at her new home and smiled. She wasn't hiding in the shadows or masking her scent anymore. In fact, she took a deep breath, letting her sweetness fill the wind, knowing that she was finally seen, finally loved, and finally home. As the sun rose higher, painting the world in gold, June leaned into her mate's embrace and let her wolf, the one she had finally found within her own heart, press forward and howl. Deep down, she knew the truth. The fairy tale wasn't about a girl becoming a wolf, but a woman finding the power to be herself. The war was over, the bond was sealed, and the wild alpha had finally found his true Luna. And as they stood together on the edge of forever, the mountain roared back in approval, and she let it happen.